14 years of being the man who showed up. 14 years of Little League games in the rain, of midnight fevers and 3 a.m. nightmares, of teaching a boy how to shake a hand and look a man in the eye and understand that your word is the only currency that doesn't devalue. And all it took to end it was my own son, sitting across from his mother at a kitchen table I'd bought, in a house I'd built, telling her every private thing I'd ever trusted him with. I'd like to say I was blindsided. I wasn't. What I was foolish. Welcome back. Grab your coffee, get somewhere quiet, and understand that the story I'm about to tell you doesn't end the way you think it does. It ends the way it needed to. Drop a comment. Subscribe if you haven't. You're going to want to stay for this one. Let me back you up. Because this story doesn't start with the betrayal. It doesn't start with the divorce either. It starts on a Tuesday evening in October, 3 years before any of this unraveled, when my son Marcus was 16 years old and sitting on the tailgate of my truck in the parking lot of a Waffle House off Highway 41, eating scattered and smothered hash browns and telling me he thought his mother was seeing someone. He said it the way teenagers say hard things. Sideways. Eyes on the food. Like if he didn't look directly at the words, they couldn't be real yet. I didn't react. That was the first thing I got right in a long time and possibly the last thing I got right for a while after. How long have you known? I asked. Few weeks, he said. Maybe more. I nodded. Took a sip of coffee that had gone cold 20 minutes ago. The parking lot was empty except for a man loading groceries into a minivan and a teenager on a bicycle going nowhere in particular. Marcus kept eating. I let him. Here's what you need to understand about Marcus before we go any further. Because this story belongs to him just as much as it belongs to me, maybe more. I nodded. Took a sip of coffee that had gone cold 20 minutes ago. The parking lot was empty except for a man loading groceries into a minivan and a teenager on a bicycle going nowhere in particular. Marcus kept eating. I let him. Here's what you need to understand about Marcus before we go any further. Because this story belongs to him just as much as it belongs to me, maybe more. Marcus Elliott Webb is 19 years old now. He is built like I was at that age, tall and angular, still figuring out where to put his hands in photographs. He has his mother's instincts and my stubbornness, which is either a gift or a warning depending on the day. He is the kind of person who apologizes before he's wrong because he can already feel it coming. He reads the room before he reads the menu. He has been doing emotional math in his head since he was 8 years old, calculating what the adults around him needed and quietly adjusting himself to provide it. That's not a compliment. That's a wound dressed up as a personality trait. And I didn't see it until it was too late to do anything about the first chapter of it. His mother, Dana, and I had been circling the end of our marriage for 2 years by the time Marcus told me about the other man. Not fighting, exactly. Fighting would have required a kind of energy and investment we'd both quietly stopped making. What we were doing was something flatter and more exhausting than fighting. We were performing a marriage for an audience of one, our son, who, as it turned out, had stopped believing the performance somewhere around the age of 14 and had simply been too kind to say so. Dana was not a villain. I want to be clear about that before I go any further because the internet has a hunger for villains and I am not interested in feeding it at her expense. Dana was a woman who had grown into someone different than the person she'd been when we were 26 and stupid and certain that love was sufficient infrastructure for a life. She had changed. I had changed. We had changed in directions that no longer faced each other and neither of us had been honest enough or brave enough to say so out loud until the silence between us had weight you could lean against. The man she was seeing, his name was Glenn, a detail I mention only because anonymizing him would require me to call him something else and I don't have the energy for that. Glenn was someone she'd known from before. Before me. Before Marcus. Before the house and the truck and the Waffle House parking lots. He was not the reason our marriage was ending. He was the symptom of a marriage that had already ended. It took me 3 years to understand that distinction. Those were not easy years. What I did with what Marcus told me that night in the parking lot was wrong. Not dramatically wrong. Not the kind of wrong that makes a good villain. The quiet kind of wrong that decent people do when they're hurting and not paying close enough attention to who's standing next to them. I talked to him like he was a confidant. Not all at once. Not in one terrible conversation. Gradually. The way water finds the cracks. Over the months that followed, as Dana and I moved from cold performance to honest conversation to mediated separation, I talked to Marcus. About things a 16-year-old should not have to carry. About the mortgage and what would happen to it. About Glenn and what I actually thought of a man who enters another man's marriage through the back door. About Dana and the specific ways she had stopped seeing me somewhere around year 9 and whether that was her failure or mine or just the math of two people who ran out of road. I told myself I was being honest with him. That I was treating him like an adult. That after years of performing a marriage he'd seen through anyway, the least I could give him was the truth. What I was actually doing was outsourcing my grief to a teenager who loved me too much to say no. Randy, my oldest friend, a man who delivers hard truths with the warmth of someone who's practiced it, told me directly at the time. We were at his kitchen table, 2 beers in, the Braves losing in the background the way they do when something else important is happening. "You're leaning on that boy," he said. "I'm being real with him," I said. "There's a difference between real and wait," Randy said. "You know the difference. You're just choosing not to use it right now." I told him he didn't understand. He looked at me the way people look at someone who is wrong and knows it. Didn't argue. Just picked up his beer. Randy had been doing that for 30 years. He was usually right and usually willing to wait. I should have listened. Instead, I talked to Marcus again the following weekend. Here's the thing about a child who does emotional math. He will carry whatever you hand him. He will carry it quietly, rearranging his own weight to accommodate yours, and he will not tell you it's heavy because he loves you, and love, to a child, has always meant absorption. Marcus absorbed everything I gave him that year. My fear about the divorce. My anger about Glenn. My grief, which I had dressed up as pragmatism and handed to him in calm, reasonable sentences that were somehow worse than crying would have been. He carried it all. And then, because he was 16 and not equipped, and because a boy doing emotional math will eventually hit a number too large to calculate alone, he told his mother. Not everything at once. I don't believe it was deliberate. I believe it started as one thing, one comment about Glenn that slipped out at the wrong moment, and then Dana, who is a precise and careful woman when she needs information, asked the right questions in the right order, and Marcus, who had been carrying a year's worth of weight in silence, simply put it down. By the time I found out, she had all of it. I found out on a Friday. I know it was a Friday because I had been planning to take Marcus to a college visit that weekend, his first one, a small state school 3 hours north that he'd been quietly excited about in the careful way he was quietly excited about everything he didn't want to jinx. Dana called at 6:47 in the evening. The call was 13 minutes long. She was not cruel. She was Dana, precise, composed, and accurate in a way that lands harder than anger ever could. When it was over, I sat in my truck in the driveway of my rented house for a long time. I'd given my son the weight of a broken marriage, and he had carried it for a year, and then he had done what any person eventually does under enough weight. He had set it down somewhere. And the somewhere he chose was his mother. I could not be angry at him. I tried, briefly, the way you try a door that you already know is locked. It didn't open. Because what I found on the other side of the anger, underneath it, was something I hadn't been ready to look at directly. I had failed him first. I called Randy. "I know," he said, before I finished the sentence. "Why didn't you stop me?" "I tried," he said. "You called me a man who didn't understand. I was wrong." "I know that too," he said. "Question is what you're going to do about it now." I didn't have an answer. So I did what I should have done a year earlier. I stopped talking and started listening. I did not call Marcus that night. Or the next morning. That took everything I had, because what I wanted to do was explain myself, which is the wrong first move, and I knew it. Explaining yourself to someone you've wronged is not accountability. It's another version of making them carry your weight. I called his school counselor instead. Then I called a therapist, not for Marcus, for myself. A man named Dr. Osei, who had an office above a dry cleaner on Peachtree and the particular gift of making silence feel productive. I went every Tuesday for 4 months. I talked about my father. I talked about Dana. I talked about the specific way I had confused honesty with intimacy and used my son as a receptacle for the difference. Dr. Osei said one thing in our third session that rearranged something structural in my thinking. A child cannot consent to being your emotional peer, he said. Even when they appear to. I sat with that for a week. The college visit happened 6 weeks later than planned. Marcus agreed to it with the careful neutrality of a boy who had not yet decided what he was agreeing to, which I understood. I drove 3 hours north with a thermos of coffee and a prepared speech that I threw out somewhere around mile 40, because prepared speeches are another form of making someone else hold your need to be forgiven. We stopped at a rest stop outside of Gainesville. Same dynamic as the Waffle House 2 years before. Same tailgate energy, though we were standing by a vending machine instead. Marcus got a Gatorade. I got a water I didn't need. I owe you an apology, I said. He looked at the vending machine. Not for what you told your mother, I said. You were carrying too much. You did what anyone does. I'm apologizing for the carrying. For giving you something that was mine to hold. He didn't say anything for a long moment. That I didn't mean for it to all come out, he said. I know. I wasn't trying to. Marcus. I waited until he looked at me. You don't owe me an explanation. I owe you one. What I gave you to carry that year was not yours. None of it was yours. Something shifted in his face. Not resolution, not yet. Something earlier than that. The specific expression of someone who has been braced for an impact that is not coming. We stood there for a while. The highway moved behind us. Is the school still an option? He said finally. That's entirely your call, I said. He nodded slowly. Drank his Gatorade. Looked out at the highway. Okay, he said. Let's go look at it. That was not forgiveness. I want to be clear about that, because forgiveness in the movies happens in parking lots with speeches and it wraps up clean. What happened at that vending machine was the beginning of a much longer, quieter, and more honest process. One that required me to keep showing up without an agenda. To ask questions and accept that some of them would not be answered yet. To be his father, which is different from being his confessor, different from being his friend, different from being the wounded man who needed somewhere to put his pain. Marcus started school that fall. He called on Sundays, sometimes. Not every Sunday. Enough. The calls were short at first. Logistical. How's the food, how's the roommate, did you get the thing I sent? Then slowly longer. Then occasionally something real. A hard class. A girl he'd noticed. A professor who reminded him of someone. One Sunday in November he called and talked for 45 minutes without me prompting a single topic. I said almost nothing. Just listened. When he hung up I sat in the quiet of my house and understood something I had come to slowly and painfully, and not a moment before I was ready. You don't rebuild trust by explaining yourself. You rebuild it by becoming, over time and without announcement, someone trustworthy. Not someone who is honest. Honest and trustworthy are not the same thing. I had been honest with my son. I had not been trustworthy. Trustworthy means your weight is your own to carry. It means your child can call you and not hang up feeling heavier than when they dialed. That's what I had to become. It took longer than I wanted and less time than I deserved. Randy asked me last spring if I regretted any of it. I thought about the Waffle House parking lot and what I had done with the information my son gave me there. I thought about 14 months of leaning on a 16-year-old. I thought about Dana's 13-minute phone call and the driveway and Dr. Osei and the rest stop outside Gainesville. I regret what I put him through, I said. I don't regret what it required me to become. Randy nodded. Didn't push it. That's 30 years of friendship working the way it's supposed to. Marcus came home for the summer. He was taller somehow, or maybe he was just taking up the space he'd always been entitled to. We rebuilt things the only way real things get rebuilt, not in one conversation, not with a speech, but in accumulated ordinary moments. Cooking dinner. Arguing about music. Driving nowhere in particular on Sunday afternoons with the windows down. One evening in July he said, out of nowhere, I think I want to be a counselor. Like, for kids. I looked at him. Because someone should do it right, he said simply. I didn't say anything. Didn't make it a moment. Just nodded and turned back to the road. But I held that sentence for a long time afterward. Because somewhere inside it was my son, doing what he had always done. Taking something that had been hard and finding the part of it worth keeping. Not because I taught him to. He'd been doing that long before I got around to being the kind of father who deserved to witness it. Some men spend years convinced that being honest with their children is the same as being good to them. I was one of those men. And it cost my son a year of weight he should never have had to carry. He carried it anyway. And then he put it down. And then he did what the best people do with the heaviest years of their lives. He decided to be useful. That's his story. I'm just grateful I'm still in it. If this one landed with you, share it with someone who needed to hear it. Subscribe if you haven't. And as always, thank you for being here.